All right, we're at 6:01. So I think we're going to get going on starting our presentation here. Thanks, everybody. I very much appreciate you joining us tonight. This is our second webinar on the Skookumchuck Dam. I'm Nat Kale. I'm a planner with the Office of Chehalis Basin. Tonight, also presenting will be Mary Martz, who is the lead for this project with the consulting firm Anchor QEA. And Casey Hart will be helping us out from Ross Strategic. She's going to be behind the scenes managing things. We have about an hour and a half for this webinar. We've got about 40 or 45 minutes of presentation, and we'll be taking several breaks as we're doing that for questions, for just a few questions. And then at the end, we will also have a session for more questions. If we finish all the questions before 7:30, we won't make you stay. We will stop early. Before I get into it, I'm going to hand it over to Casey, who's going to describe how the meeting is going to work today.
Thank you, Nat. All right, I'm just going to share my screen real quick. Oops. So just a couple notes on the technical side of things. This webinar is being recorded, and please note that all the participants are muted. Please only use the chat function to message the host with Zoom technical support questions. And if for some reason you get kicked out of the webinar and are having trouble getting back on, please email me at chart@rossstrategic.com. And you can enable your live transcripts at the bottom of your screen in the little panel. We will have time for question and answer throughout the presentation. You can put in your question and answer or questions in the box at any time during the webinar, and you can upvote and you can submit your questions anonymously. And please note that the raise hand function is disabled. We'll be enabling it at the end of the webinar for verbal questions. And if you're on a phone, you can hit *9 and we will call your name to unmute. So thank you so much, and we hope you enjoy the webinar. Back to you, Nat.
Thanks so much, Casey. All right, I'm going to go ahead and put my slides up. All right, are we all seeing that? Looking good? All right, great. So for those of you who are new to this process, this webinar is a follow-up to a webinar we held back in March. At that one, Mary and I spoke about the past and present of the Skookumchuck Dam, its history, how it's operated, and its effect on fish and flooding. Today, we're going to walk you through what we've learned over the past 6 months or so about the dam and about how the dam and the reservoir could be modified in the future. I'm going to start with some background to get you all oriented. Then Mary's going to talk about options for passing fish through the dam. And then I'll talk through some of the water modeling we've done and some options for reducing downstream flood damages. And we're going to wrap it all up by talking about how we bring these things together and some of the work we have left to do before we make our report to the Chehalis Basin Board at the end of this year or early next year. So the Skookumchuck Dam is an earthen dam on the Skookumchuck River at about River Mile 22. It's approximately halfway down this 40-mile long river. The reservoir extends about 4 miles upstream of the dam, and about 10 miles downstream of the dam is the town of Bucota, and another 8 miles or so downstream from there is the city of Centralia. The Skookumchuck Dam is really a delicate balance of 3 things: water supply, migratory fish, and downstream flooding. The dam was built in 1970 for water supply. When it was built, it was to supply water to the Centralia coal-fired steam generation facility. That facility is shutting down their second and final turbine in 2025. Last year, TransAlta, the owners and operators of the dam and the reservoir, worked with the Department of Ecology to create a water bank. This allows them to essentially sell the water that used to go to the generation facility to other users, like the cities of Centralia and Chehalis, or other downstream consumers of water. The Skookumchuck River has been home to runs of migratory fish for a very long time. Steelhead, coho, and spring and fall chinook all use the river. Back in 1970, when the dam was built, the then Department of Fisheries required mitigation for the impact of the dam on the fish. The two big things that they required were a hatchery and a fish passage facility. The hatchery still operates and raises steelhead and coho. Adult fish passage upstream of the dam is done by truck. Recently, upstream transport has been intermittent, with only steelhead being trucked by the Department of Fish and Wildlife and only in some years. And the dam, while it wasn't built for it, it does help to reduce downstream flooding. In some years, it's not much of a reduction. For instance, in 2009, and even just this spring, there was significant flooding downstream of the dam. But in other years, like 2007, the reservoir holds back enough water to make a pretty big difference. So TransAlta operates the Skookumchuck Dam by balancing those three needs. They make sure there's enough water all year round to supply for their water rights, including their own rights. And they also make sure there's enough water and cool enough water for fish to use the river. And while the dam isn't operated for flood reduction, and it's not required to be operated for flood reduction, sometimes the reservoir is low enough in the fall that it does reduce downstream flooding. The Office of Chehalis Basin, which I work for, is tasked with reducing flood damages and improving aquatic species habitat. Our goal with this project is to figure out how we can strike the best balance between these three things, reducing flooding in Bucota, Centralia, and in between, while at the same time improving the river for Chinook, coho, and steelhead, all without disrupting that vital water supply the dam provides. Phase 1 of this study began back in March of 2021. We looked at historical studies of the Skookumchuck starting back in the 60s and gathered a lot of background information. Our focus was on getting a good understanding of the dam and on making short-term recommendations for the operation of the dam. After we made a report to the board in October of 2021, we began phase 2 of this study. That's this phase. And for this phase, we've collected a lot more data and we're doing a lot more modeling. The outcome of phase 2 is going to be a report to the Chehalis Basin board, which should be done either late this year or early next year. That report is going to have everything we talk about today and a whole lot more. It's also going to have a few possible options of what we could do next with the dam. I think it's important to say, I mentioned when I started that TransAlta owns and operates the Skookumchuck Dam, and they do plan to do so for the foreseeable future. They've been great partners with us on this project, and they're going to be the ones deciding what does and does not happen with their dam. So if the Chehalis Basin Board decides they want to move forward on a scenario for the dam, the first thing we'll be doing is going right back to TransAlta to start working on a mutually acceptable course of action. What I'd like to do is pause here to see if there are any questions before I hand it over to Mary for fish passage. Casey, do you see anything in the Q&A?
I do not see anything at the moment.
All right. Well, I think we can go straight to Mary then.
All right, next slide, Nat. All right, so as Nat had mentioned, in phase 1, we really were just getting a handle on the history of the dam and the current operations and kind of compiling everything that was known to date about the dam. Didn't really do any modeling in phase 1, so some of the primary elements for this phase 2 analysis were some detailed hydraulic modeling of the reservoir, the existing fish sluice, and the Skookumchuck River downstream of the dam all the way to the Chehalis River. That allows us to further evaluate whether fish passage, flood storage, and/or dam removal is possibly feasible, and to what extent. And in addition, we have been developing concept designs for downstream fish passage. And we will also be doing an initial evaluation of potential benefits and impacts to flooding, habitat, fish passage, and water rights downstream of this from any of these scenarios. In addition, we were able to do some LiDAR and aerial photo collection upstream of the dam to understand whether the habitat upstream of the reservoir is of good quality or not, to help us understand what the potential benefits of improving fish passage, either through modifying the dam or removing it could be. Next slide. So just to orient everybody, because we'll be talking about several features of the dam, just wanted to give you an overview. So this is a Google aerial over the top of the dam. And so basically the reservoir is to the right, the flow is from right to left going downstream. You're seeing the dam. And then these two arrows that I've got down on sort of the left bank of the reservoir and dam show one where the existing fish sluice is. It is in the left corner of the dam. And there's also an existing spillway that the fish sluice is integrated into the spillway. And then the other arrow is pointing to the approximate location of a multi-level intake system that is the current way that a lot of the, well, basically all of the water discharges from the dam unless the reservoir is so high that it is spilling over the spillway. So that's basically the inlet and outlet system on the left bank of the dam. Next slide. And this is just a schematic showing you the ways that water gets through the dam and out and downstream. So as I had mentioned, there's the spillway and fish sluice on the left abutment of the dam that goes directly downstream through a chute. And then there's this multi-level intake that can take water from various depths within the reservoir and discharge either to the hatchery, through the hydropower turbine, which is a small hydropower turbine, or to an outlet at the downstream end of the dam. So there's sort of three primary ways that water comes out: through this intake outlet system, or through the spillway and fish sluice, and all of the water that is discharged through these pathways enters the river downstream. Next slide. And so this is also another schematic just to orient you, because we'll talk a few times maybe about the spillway and the fish sluice. But just for reference, the dam crest is about 20 feet higher than the spillway crest is. It's 497 feet elevation, whereas the spillway crest is at 477 feet elevation. So whenever the reservoir reaches 477 feet, it starts to spill over the spillway. The fish sluice that is built into the spillway has a bottom elevation of 464 feet. So when the reservoir is between the elevations of 464 feet and 477 feet, water can go through the fish sluice. When the reservoir drops below that point, there is no longer water going into the fish sluice, and so there would be no downstream passage once the reservoir drops below that elevation. And then, as I mentioned, there's this multi-level intake at various elevations, from a high down to a low at 378 feet. And then there is a bit of dead storage at the bottom of the very bottom of the reservoir, below that lowest intake. Next slide. So in phase 2, as I mentioned, modeling was one of the big elements of what we've been working on. And there were actually 3 different models that we've been working on. So there was a reservoir simulation model that allows us to kind of route inflows that are coming into the reservoir from upstream through the reservoir and dam, and we can then analyze scenarios of different operations. So if there's, X amount of flow coming in upstream, such as during a flood event, how could the reservoir store it and then release it downstream? And same for fish passage. If there was certain flow coming in upstream, how long could you maintain elevation high enough to allow fish passage downstream? We also built a 3-dimensional model for the fish sluice area in particular, because it allows a much more detailed look, because fish passage structures and fish that are using them are very sensitive to the velocities, potential eddies, and other things that are happening right in proximity to a fish sluice. And so it was really important to understand whether or not the existing or potential future fish sluice could be designed that would actually meet all of the state and federal criteria that have been designated that allow good fish passage. And then the third model is the 2-dimensional hydraulic model that's being used for the rest of the Chehalis Basin strategy, and has been used to show flooding elevations and floodplain extents for the rest of the strategy, has a lower Skookumchuck component, and this part of the model has been updated with new bathymetry that was collected from Bucota downstream. And we can also evaluate then based on the discharges that we are analyzing for the different scenarios from the dam, how that might change conditions downstream of the dam. And I do want to mention that Watershed Science and Engineering is doing all of this modeling as part of the consultant team. Next slide. So I'm going to focus now on the fish passage element. One of the first things that we have been doing in this year's study was to have several biologists evaluate the existing fish passage facility, the fish collection facility for adults. This was built at the same time that the dam was built, and it's intended to be used for adult fish collection and distribution, and the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife operates it. It's currently only used for steelhead, as Nat had mentioned, and what they do at this fish collection facility is collect fish for broodstock for the hatchery, and as well as fish that are donated to various food banks in the basin, as well as potentially returning some fish downstream for additional fishing opportunities. And then they additionally trap and haul, in some years, adult steelhead upstream of the reservoir. For its current purposes, it is effective, and however, due to the size of the facility, if there were a lot more fish in the future that returned to the dam, and hopefully as part of the Chehalis Basin strategy, there will be increasing numbers of fish in the future, there would need to be some upgrades in order to actually handle larger numbers of fish, or if we wanted to pursue passing other species such as coho and chinook upstream, there would also likely need to be some upgrades made. But for its current purposes, it is effective. Next slide. So then focusing on juvenile passage downstream, coming from upstream of the dam downstream, we looked at the existing spillway and fish sluice. And this is a photo showing kind of the downstream part of the spillway and fish sluice where they discharge into a long chute that returns through this slot back to the Skookumchuck River. And the current fish sluice does present some difficulties for safe passage. There's pretty high velocities coming out of the chute, depending upon what elevation the reservoir is at upstream. It's pretty turbulent. You can see all that white water coming out of the fish sluice. And once the fish enter this chute that returns back to the river, there's very shallow flow. What is called in modeling is actually supercritical. It's really fast flow downstream. There are also some abrupt changes in flow direction as water comes out of the sluice and plops down into this holding stilling basin before it then goes into the chute. And depending upon the weather that has occurred that year, if there are flood events that may have brought wood and other debris downstream from further upstream in the watershed, there could also be debris blockages on the upstream side that would reduce the ability of fish to even enter the fish sluice. So next slide. So we looked at several options because the existing condition, while it certainly may provide some passage, it definitely has challenges. So one option would be to modify this existing fish sluice. And this photo is showing the upstream side of the sluice there with the grading that is built into the spillway. You can also see in the foreground of that photo that there's a number of rocks and a channel that approaches the fish sluice. And so this was part of when the dam was originally built, this abutment was built into a bedrock area, bedrock bank slope. And so this channel was blasted into the existing bedrock to allow a nice channel to approach the fish sluice. However, it does have some areas where there's possible eddies and fast flows and other things that might disorient fish as they approach the fish sluice. And so when we were looking at the ways that this existing fish sluice could be modified, there's a lot of things that would have to actually be done. We could do some further blasting to smooth out that entrance topography, because to be most effective for fish to get into a sluiceway, nice smooth flows are the best way for fish to actually find their way through. Um, we did also look at if you did smooth out the top side, you could actually build something on the downstream end that would avoid having fish drop out kind of in that fire hose situation into the stilling basin and shoot. Um, but that also poses some issues when water is spilling over the top of the spillway, that it could potentially damage what we're looking at downstream. It's the next slide. I'll go into a schematic that shows that option. So the existing fish sluice is kind of coming into the corner of the spillway, and the top side of the schematic is in the reservoir. The downstream, or the down portion of the schematic, is the downstream side of the spillway. So fish would enter the spillway, and rather than plopping down into the chute, we could construct sort of an elevated flume that would safely transport them into a holding tank that could be attached to the side of the left abutment of the dam. And then you could bring a truck in there and basically trap and haul juveniles downstream the same way that adults are transported upstream currently. But as I had mentioned, when water is actually spilling over the top of the spillway, it certainly could hit this flume and might cause damage. And if there's debris being carried in the reservoir, that similarly could come over the top of the spillway and could potentially damage the flume. And so there are concerns about modifying the existing sluiceway, that there's a lot of challenges to that. So next slide. So a second option would be you could build a new sluiceway that would be to the side of the spillway, which would eliminate some of those concerns about water spilling over the spillway and interfering with anything you're trying to do with the sluiceway. Similarly, it would require smoothing the upstream topography. It would also require boring a tunnel basically through the left dam abutment, which leads to currently some geotechnical and structural questions that have not yet been investigated, but it would require a new tunnel. But based on the angle at which this sluiceway would go from the reservoir, we would be able to create better debris trapping and maintenance conditions. You wouldn't be right against the spillway, you'd be sort of to the side of it. And so you wouldn't have so many of the same issues with wood and other material coming through the spillway. And so this schematic shows a similar flume and holding tank, which is one option for how fish could then pass downstream via trap and haul. But there are other options as well. Next slide. So you could create a much longer flume that would just allow fish, once they entered the sluice, to continue passively downstream, just on their merry way through a flume system. This is used in many other dams, such as on the Columbia and Snake Rivers. There are long flume passageways that come out of dams, and they are highly effective. But you do have to drop down nearly 200 feet in elevation, and to meet current fish criteria, that slope of the flume cannot be particularly steep. It should only be about a 4% grade. And so it means that your flume to return back to the river is about 3,100 feet up to 3,500 feet, depending upon the pathway. So on the left photo, just showing a SketchUp of, you could do a helical way of turning and slowly dropping the elevation of the flume down within the existing chute, so you wouldn't have to go too far away from the dam. Or the second option on the right photo would be to create a flume pathway that returned all the way back down to the river downstream of all of the dam infrastructure. And that's another option. So next slide. So using these potential fish sluice options, then there was reservoir simulation, and the three-dimensional modeling was conducted to identify, yes, could you actually make this happen, and what would be the effects? So for a fish passage only option, you would intend that much of the flow, much of the discharge from the dam actually goes through the fish sluice during the time period when you're wanting to operate it, rather than taking as much flow through the intakes and multiple outlet situations. So you try to keep the reservoir as high as possible and send most of the discharge through the fish sluice, so that you can have a longer period when it is passable for juvenile fish. And so looking at this table on the left side, the left column, it says max discharge through sluice. So it's varying flows that we might consider passing through the sluice, from pretty high flows, 120 cubic feet per second, down to 25 cubic feet per second. And this was based on considering how much flow does it actually take to attract fish over to this corner? Like, how much flow would they actually notice and see a pathway downstream? Somewhere in this range would be sufficient to attract fish. In addition to discharging through the sluice, there is 20 CFS that is delivered to the hatchery pretty much all the time. And so we would add 20 CFS that would continue to be discharged to the hatchery at all times. So the total discharge from the dam is actually the left column plus 20 CFS. So this is not in consideration of what TransAlta currently is required to discharge from the dam to meet all the water right obligations, but the top two lines actually are within the typical zone of discharges that currently occur from the dam. So if you have at least 65 CFS going through the fish sluice, you're getting pretty close to what is normally discharged through the multi-level intakes already. And what that told us is basically through the late winter, springtime, and summertime, when juvenile fish might be wishing to pass downstream, we can actually keep the reservoir high enough so that the reservoir does not drop below the fish sluice until September 19 for the 65 CFS scenario. That's the median date when you could keep fish passage going, which pretty much encompasses the time period when juvenile fish would like to migrate downstream. Or with a higher discharge, 120 CFS, you have a sooner date. By the median date of the 21st of July, you would typically drop the reservoir elevation below the fish sluice and could no longer pass fish at that point. But it does vary year to year, and so there's an earliest and a latest date shown as well. And then if you're discharging very low volumes through the fish sluice, such as 40 CFS or 25, you pretty much keep the reservoir full all year until the next rainy season starts into October. And under current operations, where TransAlta is operating the reservoir to hold water supply and provide water supply downstream, they try to keep the reservoir as full as possible most of the time as well. And so a fish passage operation like this would not result in much of a change from current operations based on what's currently been happening. Next slide. So basically the takeaways from this analysis, and there will be some additional analysis to come, but currently, as I mentioned, the upstream passage for adult steelhead is effective, but there's clearly some upgrades that would need to happen to handle larger numbers of fish or other species. We have also asked another firm, the Whoosh firm, that operates those tube systems to transport fish over dams. They have also provided a conceptual analysis of what it would take to use their system to pass adults over the dam. So we're looking at multiple options. Downstream passage could be upgraded to meet current fish passage criteria and be functional, basically from winter through midsummer or later, if operations were also modified. As I mentioned, if we proposed doing a new fish sluice through the left abutment of the dam, there's some key geotechnical and structural questions and concerns that would have to be investigated in a future design phase. But an initial cost estimate for a new sluice and flume system range from about $6 million to $10 million. Next slide. So with that, I'll pause, I think, for a couple of questions.
Yes, we have a couple questions going now. Our first question is, depending on the outcome of this discovery, would TransAlta entertain the idea of selling their dam and steam plant to the state of Washington to allow the state to manage this asset?
Maybe I'll
Would you
defer
like
to
me to
you,
answer
Nat.
that one, Mary?
Yeah.
The short answer is that option has not come up in our conversations about the dam or with TransAlta. So that's something that we would have to put to them and see if they were willing to entertain it.
All right. Next, we have, why hasn't the dam already been retrofitted with a more modern and effective fish passage system, such as those in place on many other rivers?
Yeah, so the short answer is that the Skookumchuck Dam is not in the same regulatory jurisdiction and process that many other dams are in the state of Washington that are under the FERC process where they get relicensed every 50 years. The hydropower turbine that is present on the Skookumchuck Dam is small enough to be exempt from FERC licensing. The entire steam plant facility, which includes the dam to some extent, is under FERC jurisdiction, but Skookumchuck Dam has simply not had to go through some of the relicensing and upgrading and other considerations that a lot of other dams have had to go through in the past, because it's a little bit of a unique situation.
All right. How is water withdrawal considered the three models?
We may have to follow up with more detail because I think your question is directed at water withdrawals downstream of the dam. And so for the reservoir simulation model, it's not included because the reservoir simulation model only looks at discharges from the dam, inflows into the dam and discharges from the dam, as does the 3D model that looks specifically at the fish sluice. The downstream two-dimensional model is not yet complete, and so I don't have results for you on that, so I can't answer that question right now. So I think we want to go back to Nat at this point, and we'll catch up with the additional questions a little bit later.
Yeah, I think we can do that just to make sure we've got enough time to get through everything we've got on our presentation here. Thanks, Mary. So Mary just talked a lot about what we're doing for fish passage. I'm going to talk a little about the options we're using to address flooding. And I'm also going to talk about what we're doing to try and combine those two. So to use a dam to reduce flooding, you need to hold back a lot of water. In order to do that, you need to do one of two things, or better yet, both of these things at the same time. You need to have a big reservoir, and you need to make sure you have a way to empty that reservoir out quickly. These are both ways to make sure that when a big storm comes, there's enough capacity behind the dam for that water, so it doesn't just run downstream and flood people out. At the Skookumchuck Dam, this means our goal for reducing flooding is to keep water from overtopping the spillway at 477 feet as much as possible. Basically, lower is better. We looked at both of the approaches that I mentioned to reducing flooding, increasing the reservoir's capacity and increasing the discharge capacity. And our computer modeling showed that a combination of the two would be the best way to reduce it. Now, in the past, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers looked at increasing the height of the reservoir by adding gates or other structures to the top of the dam, and they found it really wasn't feasible to do that. So instead, we spent a lot more time looking at increasing the volume of water that the existing reservoir can hold back. We looked at 3 different capacities, and each of these corresponds to a different elevation in the dam. So those capacities were 12, 20, and 35,000 acre feet. And each of those volumes of water, as I said, corresponds to a specific target elevation of the reservoir during the winter. So basically, instead of going up by building more space, we're going down by taking out more water. I'm going to be talking about acre feet a lot, so I'll just quickly give you this orientation here. An acre foot is just 1 acre of land filled up to 1 foot with water. So it's a lot of water. an acre is approximately 1 football field. So hopefully that's fairly easy to visualize. 35,000 acre feet is the maximum capacity of the reservoir. That's the volume between the top of the spillway, where the dam is no longer doing much, water is just running past it, and the lowest point at which we can take water out of the reservoir. That's called the active pool. It's the area of the dam that we can actually manage. 12 and 20,000 acre feet are obviously less than that, so those would be easier targets to meet. And what we found was that rain comes too hard and too fast in the winter for the existing pipes in the dam to keep up, even with our easiest target of 12,000 acre feet. And I'm just going to go through some quick flood math to back that up. I have a lot of numbers in my presentation, so I apologize for that for folks who don't appreciate that, but I will try to make them make sense. So we know that the reservoir can hold about 35,000 acre feet of water. We know that the current pipes through the dam can discharge about 600 acre feet per day. So that means that it takes about 55 days, or about 2 months, to fully empty out the reservoir. And that assumes that the pipes are open all the way and that there's no new rain coming in. And the numbers are, of course, more complicated than that, which is why we use computer models. But these are approximately accurate. It takes about 2 months to fully empty out the reservoir. And as we know, nature does not give us 2 months of rain-free days after every storm. So to keep the reservoir low, we actually simulated running the dam with a succession of bigger pipes than exist today. Those pipes were 2, 4, and 6,000 acre feet per day. That's the discharge amount. That's how much water they can discharge at any given time. And then we compared that to the reservoir sizes I mentioned earlier, the 12, 20, and 35,000 acre feet reservoir sizes. And then we ran 9 different computer simulations, one for each combination of pipe size and water storage. So basically what we did is we ran the last 15 years of rainfall through each of those combinations and looked at what came out of the dam. We got a lot of information out of those simulations, but we really focus on one number. And this is the highest discharge over that 15-year span. That told us what's the biggest flood that we would have seen over that span. And those are the numbers that you're seeing here in this table. And I understand when you get to the numbers, it can be hard to tell what they actually mean on the ground. So here's something to help put those in context. This year, in January, there was some significant flooding on the Skookumchuck River in Bucota. At the peak, on January 7th, that flooding was about 22,000 acre feet per day before it started dropping again. At that level, Bucota was experiencing some significant flooding, as was Centralia downstream. Later, on March 1st of this year, the Skookumchuck River hit a lower peak of around 12,000 acre feet per day. At that level, there was some flooding, but in Bucota and Centralia, it was mostly nuisance flooding. It was not a major threat. Across our 9 scenarios, as you can see in the table here, we got numbers between 3,000 acre feet per day and 23,000 acre feet per day. So from no downstream flooding at all, up to pretty major flooding that exceeded that recent January event. The best scenario that we saw, the one that we felt represents the smallest intervention to the river while still maximizing the downstream flood protection, was with the 2 middle scenarios. So that is to say, a 20,000 acre foot target storage capacity in the reservoir and a 4,000 acre foot per day capacity pipe. That scenario gives us about 11,000 acre feet per day maximum discharge, which is just less than that March 1 event of this year, so closer to that nuisance flooding scenario. Of course, to get this reduction, we would have to put a much larger outlet through the dam, which would entail major reconstruction. So the big takeaway here is that with a pretty major modification to the dam, we think we could significantly reduce peak flows downstream. Now, Mary spoke about the fish passage options, and I spoke about the flood reduction options just now. And of course, TransAlta has to keep a base amount of water flowing for water rights. With the computer models that we've put together, we were also able to simulate an operation model for the dam that balanced all three of those needs. As it turns out, we think that that same scenario that I talked about that reduces downstream flooding could also improve fish passage while keeping enough water in the river for water rights holders. So this is a challenge because the way that we manage the dam for fish and the way we manage the dam for flooding is different. As we've talked about, for flooding, of course, we want to keep the reservoir low, especially in the fall and winter. But for fish, as Mary mentioned, our goal is to keep the water up around the top of the dam, above that fish sluice, so that juvenile fish have a path to migrate downstream, especially in the spring and summer. And the way that we manage that is pretty simple. We draw down the reservoir in the fall and we let it fill up again in the spring. But right now, with the relatively small pipes in the dam, we can't do that. Instead, it looks more like this graph. The reservoir elevation goes up in the fall and it stays high most of the winter and into the spring when it starts dropping. In the summer, it continues to draw down and then it shoots back up again in the fall. Basically, right now, the reservoir elevations match the amount of rainfall that we've gotten in the past few months. There's a lot of variation, of course, depending on whether we've had a wet year or a dry year or when storms happen, all of those things. But this is the overall shape. Most years look about like this. But with a larger outlet, we can change that around. We can let water out of the reservoir in the fall, anticipating the rains that are about to come. Then we can keep the reservoir lower in the winter during the wettest part of the year so that we always have the capacity to trap water when a storm comes. In the spring, as the rain is tapering off, we can fill the reservoir back up so that by the time juvenile fish like coho and steelhead are looking to travel downstream, the water is high enough to let them out through the fish sluice. We keep it as high as we can all summer long while making sure there's enough water in the river for water rights holders before we draw it down again in the fall. So let's take a look more specifically at what happens during a storm. So this graph represents what happens right now. When a storm approaches the area, this is what the reservoir does. It's slowly drawing down as the storm approaches, with the pipes discharging at their maximum, but fairly low capacity. Then the rain hits and the water elevation in the reservoir jumps up fast. If it's a big enough storm, the reservoir overtops the spillway, which lets a lot of water downstream fast, and that's when we see flooding. When the rain stops, the reservoir quickly drops back down to the elevation of the spillway, and then it starts slowly dropping again. You can see that for a long time after the storm, if another storm hits, there's little to no capacity in the reservoir to absorb it. But with a bigger outlet, storms can look more like this. Once a storm is forecast, the dam can release water quickly to create more space in the reservoir before the rain even shows up. Then when the storm hits the reservoir, it doesn't get as high. In most cases, it shouldn't even overtop the spillway. And once the storm passes, the reservoir can be quickly drawn back down to a set point, the 20,000 foot acre capacity that I mentioned earlier. So there's plenty of room in the reservoir for the next storm. An obvious question when you're looking at this is, why don't we just draw the reservoir down as far as we can? There are a couple of reasons for that. First, we want to make sure there's enough water in the reservoir to keep water flowing for water rights holders all year long. And second, later in the season, when we start getting towards the spring, we need to make sure there's enough water in there so that when the rains taper off, we can still fill the reservoir back up to the top for the fish. So going back all the way to the beginning here, we talked about three things that we needed to address with the Skookumchuck Dam: water supply, flooding, and fish passage. And what our computer modeling is showing us is that we might be able to do that, to address those with a pretty major physical change to the dam. All right, I'm going to pause there and answer any questions before I hand it back to Mary to wrap things up today.
All right, we got quite a few questions going now. Starting back earlier, what was the volume and species of fish in the upper river prior to the dam?
Yeah, I don't know those numbers off the top of my head. There was an old study produced by the Department of Fisheries at the time that estimated the habitat capacity and the number of spawning fish that could use the area upstream of the reservoir. But I do want to mention that there had been 3 splash dams present on the Skookumchuck River for decades, from the late 1800s until about 1940, which probably significantly modified the number of fish species that were and their presence and distribution in the Skookumchuck River prior to Skookumchuck Dam being built. So some of that old information is very helpful, but is maybe not entirely representative of how much capacity there really is upstream of the reservoir.
All right. Why are steelhead hauled over the dam only occasionally by DFW?
So part of the mitigation requirement initially with the dam, as mentioned, was to build the hatchery and to transport adult fish over the dam. And so for many years, steelhead were hauled over the dam, and that was the only mitigation requirement was for steelhead, not for other species. But there was some significant disease outbreaks about 20 years ago, I guess it was. And so DFW stopped hauling fish over the dam because it was significantly affecting the hatchery production. And so they stopped for a while and then have more recently started again transporting fish over the dam.
All right. So we have a couple people wondering, do you have any idea of the mortality rate for juvenile salmonoids when immigrating through the existing sluiceway? If you do, how does that mortality rate compare to immigration within a natural river system?
So there are no studies currently on the survival of fish through Skookumchuck Dam, as I had mentioned, because it's not under the same authority as many other dams in the Northwest. There hasn't been the same level of study and requirements based on FERC licensing. So there haven't really been any studies of survival.
Would you like some more questions?
Well,
I think there's one question that came up in chat that we should probably answer before we move on, and that question was about the potential costs of the physical modification that I just mentioned. Mary, I know you sent me that answer, but I don't have it to hand. If you happen to have it, are you willing to answer that question?
Yeah, so this is preliminary, very conceptual level. Has not really gone through design, but yeah, to actually build a tunnel or bore a tunnel through either the left or right bedrock abutments adjacent to the dam for a much larger pipe outlet is somewhere in the range of $40 to $60 million.
40 to 60 million. Thanks, Mary.
All right. Another one?
Well, maybe I can just finish the last couple slides and then we can have a longer Q&A. Yeah. So just to wrap up, so dam removal was definitely one of the scenarios that we have been looking at in both phases 1 and 2. In phase 1, it was looked at in a little more detail for some conceptual examples and range of costs. And so we didn't take that any further yet in phase 2. We're trying to bring the fish passage and flood storage options up to a similar level of conceptual estimating. However, we have recently been talking with TransAlta, and as they have their water bank that has been approved as of this year, and they are intending to make those water rights available to anyone who wishes to purchase them. And they're planning to continue to operate the dam for the foreseeable future. They have stated they are not currently interested in removing Skookumchuck Dam. We are still going to bring this forward in our report, and they're definitely willing to consider the implications of any of the scenarios we've looked at. But as Nat mentioned, to do anything at the dam certainly requires cooperation and interest from TransAlta. So at this point in time, they're not interested in dam removal. However, just a few other considerations to remind folks, or if you weren't at the March webinar, removing the dam does essentially eliminate any flood benefit from the dam because it's no longer there. It does provide natural passage and about 4 miles of additional habitat available for fish. And the initial dam removal costs based on recent dam removals in the Northwest range from $20 to $50 million. That does not include additional restoration upstream of the reservoir. It would pretty much be dam removal and work right in the immediate area. And it also does not account for the fact that if water rights are lost downstream of the dam, there would be a need to mitigate and or possibly compensate folks for water rights, which could be many millions of dollars as well. So next slide. So the remaining work to finish out this phase 2 study, which is going to be happening over the next couple of months, really is evaluating the potential fish benefits of the scenarios. We've been talking about hydraulic modeling all tonight, and we haven't talked about fish benefits. And so that's actually happening right now through the EDT model that was also used for the rest of the Chehalis Basin strategy, including the aquatic species restoration plan. So we will be updating that model with these scenarios to understand how much benefit there really is. And then also evaluating the downstream effects of the scenarios, flooding effects in particular, as well as a more qualitative evaluation of the potential effects and risks to water rights downstream from the scenarios. And then wrapping this all up into a report for delivery to the board on the schedule of approximately December or January for completing all of that work. So I think with that, that was the end of our presentation. So now we do have time for more questions.
We have quite a few questions, so. All right. Who are the water rights holders?
That's a great question. So right now, the TransAlta still effectively owns their water right. They set up an agreement with the Department of Ecology to establish a water bank. And what that allows them to do is sell mitigation, which is a confusing term in this context, but mitigation for new applications for water rights downstream of the dam. So if somebody wanted to pull more water out for like a city wanted to pull out more water for their residents, for an industrial use or for irrigation, they could first ask TransAlta to sell them a mitigation right, which ecology would confirm, the Department of Ecology would confirm. And then the Department of Ecology, once they'd confirmed the mitigation, would go through a process for establishing a new water right. So the short answer to that question is right now it's TransAlta, but in the future there may be more. And I should also mention that there are other rights holders, water rights holders along the Skookumchuck. They're much smaller than TransAlta, but they exist and they are of course important. So it's not exclusively TransAlta.
Yeah, and I was gonna maybe just chime in that, yeah, there are several dozen water rights downstream of the dam owned by individuals for irrigation, owned by cities for community water, owned by industrial organizations for industrial water supply. So there's a multitude of water rights downstream of the dam.
All right. Will you get a grant for these changes?
We don't have an answer for that yet. So we're in really early stages right now. We're just exploring possibilities. We don't anticipate any construction in the next few years, even if we moved at the fastest possible clip and TransAlta was supportive of what we wanted to do. Certainly, if we did move forward with one of these options, we would be looking at every funding source available. So that would include state funding sources and federal funding sources and all of that.
Right. Have any efforts been made upstream of the reservoir to keep the reservoir water more consistent, such as reducing timber harvest, making sure large trees remain along tributaries, and or other methods of slowing water down?
Mary, do you want to take that one?
Sure. The primary land use upstream of the reservoir is timber or managed forests. And currently, anyone that is conducting logging operations does have to operate under the state's Forest Practices Act, which does require riparian buffers. That law has only been in effect since the 90s. So, riparian zones are growing. But yeah, everything that is conducted upstream of the dam that falls under the Forest Practices Act is conducted according to those acts.
I wanted to add one thing to that too, and Mary, correct me if I'm wrong here. We don't know exactly what the hydrology was like before European settlement, of course, but I think it's unlikely that upstream management practices would be able to supplement summer flows the same way the dam does. Would that be an accurate statement to say, Mary?
Well, yeah, I mean, if there was an old growth forest upstream of the dam, it would probably dampen peak flows and increase low flows to a certain extent, just to the much greater holding capacity of a more mature forest. And as well, prior to European settlement, there were likely beaver dams and other such things located, especially in the area of the existing reservoir where there's kind of a nice floodplain, or historically was. So there would have been differences, but it would not be to the same degree, perhaps, that we can manipulate flows based on the dam.
Right. We have a couple of questions circulating around TransAlta. So who is buying water from TransAlta now? And have you heard anything from TransAlta about the dam?
Well, I'll answer the second question first. TransAlta is part of our team looking into these questions. So they've been intimately involved with all of the options that we've looked at. They've also been the ones who've allowed us onto the dam site multiple times to physically look at things and map things. So yes, we're in regular communication with TransAlta. And I think that's probably all I can say. I don't want to put words in their mouth, but they've been a great partner so far for this project. What was the first question again, Casey?
Who is buying water from TransAlta now?
And again, this is their business, and I don't want to get too far into it. I think it's public knowledge that they are working with the city of Centralia on a potential water purchase from the bank. But apart from that, I can't speak to their business transactions.
All right. Would maintaining the dam at a higher level for possible fish passage improvement than reducing the fall volume hold back for flood events? Should I say that on again?
Yeah, I think I didn't quite get that.
Sorry. Would maintaining the dam at a higher level for possible fish passage improvement reduce fall volume and hold that back for flood events?
Yeah, so if the single purpose of fish passage scenario was pursued, it would, as I mentioned, it wouldn't have that much significant difference from how the dam is currently operated, which only incidentally provides flood protection, but it might have some benefits. But if a combined flood storage and fish passage solution was pursued, then it would actually improve flood storage and reduce flood flows downstream, while also trying to balance fish passage.
All right. Why could we not create equally spaced large terrace pools off to the opposite side of the dam from the spillway to allow fish to naturally transit the pools under their own power, avoiding the impossible spillway?
So essentially like creating a fish ladder or a fishway around the dam. And that could be considered. The dam was built in this bedrock slot, so that's not actually a super easy proposition, but it could absolutely be looked at in another future phase. It was not under the scope of the current study.
All right. Has the resulting annual number of fish been modeled for each possible approach? There's a couple parts to this. Does any of these approaches consider taking out the dam? Since survival of fish is so important, can we see the impact on fish numbers for each possible approach, including the removal of the dam, even if that approach may not seem practical to implement?
Yeah, and so you might have typed that question in before I mentioned that we have not yet completed the fish modeling. So yeah, that is definitely a part of what's being done. It's not so much the annual number, but it's called the equilibrium abundance. So it's like a typical number, and so yeah, that's a very important thing to show how much difference each scenario might make on fish populations.
And there was a part of that question that was about dam removal. And we do plan to look at dam removal. We're not ignoring that option, even though it's not something that TransAlta plans to go forward with.
Yeah, so we will be getting fish numbers for the dam removal scenario as well.
If you release water ahead of the storm and fill the downstream channel, what is the risk of making downstream flooding worse by eliminating the ability to convey local inflows?
So this question is from Dave Curtis, and answering hydrogeological questions posed by a hydrogeologist is always tricky. So Dave, I think the answer to that is, Mary mentioned sort of towards the beginning, we have 3 separate models that we're looking at. And one of them is an updated, extremely detailed 2-dimensional hydrologic model of the Skookumchuck River. We have been looking at inflows along the stream as part of that model. That's part of what that is. So we don't have those answers yet. Our partners, Watershed Science and Engineering, are developing and refining that model right now, but that is going to be part of what they look at. Anything to add, Mary?
Yeah, I think that's good.
Okay.
Okay. Wow. I heard fish sluice options and discharge pipe options, but what about a dam removal option?
Yeah, that
That was touched.
will be part of this report.
Okay. Any idea if native coho make it above the dam?
No, not at this time. They're not transported above the dam.
Why is TransAlta allowed to sell the water rights at this time? It seems merely a way to up the ante and make any dam removal impossible. Couldn't the water rights just revert to the natural flow of the river without the dam?
So Washington, like many Western states, has very complicated and very specific water rights laws about what is and is not allowed to be done. TransAlta has a water right that's established with the reservoir that is a property right. It belongs to them. There are a variety of things that you're allowed to do with a water right. The question is, the person who asked the question is correct that if a water right is unused, it can, in certain circumstances, revert back to the river. But there are very specific legal guidelines around how that happens. And those were not met with this. TransAlta has been using their water, so it continued to be used beneficially. And then when they decided, or they knew that they were going to turn down or close down the steam generation facility, they decided to pursue this water banking option, which is another option that's established in law in Washington, and is a path that was available to them. They went through the process, they went through a public process, they asked for comment, and they worked with the Department of Ecology to establish that bank. So this isn't a case where anybody other than TransAlta gets to decide what to do with their water rights. This is a case of private property where, very similar to if you own your house or you own your yard, you get to make most of the decisions about how that is dealt with.
All right. Okay. If TransAlta wants to keep the dam because it provides money to them for the water rights, what are they willing to pay to improve the fish passage, etc.?
I don't think we can really answer that question. TransAlta has certainly signaled to us that they're more than willing to entertain a variety of options, many of which would be a significant improvement to fish passage. And I think, Mary, you already spoke a little bit to the regulatory situation around TransAlta and the dam, and why fish passage is the way it is right now.
Okay. There's a couple parts to this person's question. What cost modeling has there been done of compensation for water rights? That's the first part.
We have not done cost modeling for compensation for water rights.
The second part, what cost modeling has there been done of impacts to downstream property from the dam removal?
Yeah, similarly, no cost modeling yet. This is very conceptual stage, and no scenario has been put forward as a preferred pathway. And so there would be more detailed analysis during an actual design of any of these options. But at this point, it's very conceptual.
And then has there been modeling on a pending Chehalis Basin project and interaction of Skookumchuck and Chehalis flows during flood events with that project?
Is that regarding the proposed flood retention facility? Possibly. So yes, the current two-dimensional model that is being used to look at Skookumchuck is the same model that is used for the rest of the basin. So there could be modeling done to evaluate the interactions of the two things.
Okay. Any idea when the water rights in the water bank will be for sale to the watershed residents?
Well, the water bank is being actively marketed right now. So if you require a water right, I think you can start your conversation with the Department of Ecology and TransAlta about potentially acquiring a mitigation from their bank. It's worth pointing out that for most residents, the question of water rights doesn't really come up. If you just have a residential well, you don't need to get a water right. Those are so-called permit exempt wells, that they fall under a different regulatory category. So these water rights are for larger water users. Like, for instance, if you have fields or cattle and you're withdrawing water from or near the river in order to water your crops or your livestock, that might require a water right. But if you just own your home and you just have a domestic well, you don't need a water right.
All right. Are there any grants available for the improvements that need to be made?
Well, we're not at the point of seeking funds for this yet. But as I said earlier, we will definitely be, if the board decides that they want to move forward with one of these options and TransAlta is amenable, we will certainly be looking at every possible fund source. Mary, I don't know if you know of specific fund sources to answer that question or not.
Well, actually, as part of the infrastructure bill that was recently passed at the federal level, there is additional money available in programs such as fish passage programs. And so if the board decides they do want to move forward with something like that, there could be federal money available. Similarly, as part of the infrastructure bill, there may be avenues related to the larger outlets. So there could be federal money, although that's coming up quickly. It might happen before we actually make decisions and negotiate things. So there's options, but we haven't really pursued any of them at this point in time.
Could the water rights be purchased for in-stream fish use?
Yes. That was an easy one.
All right. Can you help me understand the water banking concept? How does a credit from the Skookumchuck Bank offset impacts of water rights or modification of water rights downstream?
That is a great question. So I'm going to take a first shot at it, and then Mary, please jump in if I get this wrong.
I don't know if I can.
Okay.
There's also a follow-up part to that question. So
Okay. So water banking is confusing. It just is. But basically the way it works is this. If you have someone who already has a water right, especially a substantial water right, like TransAlta does, they already remove that water from the river year round. So they're pumping about a little over 50 cubic feet per second out of the Skookumchuck River all the time. It's less now because they turned off their steam turbine, but it was a little over 50 cubic feet. So when they stop pumping, that means that water is now physically in the river. There's more of it. Under water law in Washington, we have a first in time, first in right. So there's basically a stack of people who have the right to withdraw certain amounts of water from the river. So once the physical water is gone in the river, including the amount of water that's reserved for fish, then nobody else gets to take that water. It's gone. It's closed. And only the folks who already got their rights get to remove that water. Now, if one of those people is like TransAlta and says, I don't need this water anymore, there's a couple of things that could happen. One is it can revert back to the river. The water right just goes away. And then there's more physical water available into the river. And that could go in a few directions. New water rights could be granted, or that could end up being reserved for fish, for aquatic species. But if that water rights holder goes to the Department of Ecology, which manages water rights, and they say, I want to establish a water bank, what happens is the physical water goes back in the river, but then the Department of Ecology can establish new water rights that refer to that old one and say, this is where that physical water is coming from. It's coming from this old water right. So, like I said, TransAlta, 50 CFS. If they bank that, now there's 50 more CFS in the river. New water rights holder or new water rights applicant comes and says, I want to take 20 CFS out of the river. Ecology says, talk to TransAlta and have them sell you a credit. TransAlta sells them a credit for 20 CFS, and now they can withdraw 20 CFS. And that keeps happening until the bank is fully allocated. That's my absolute best description of a water bank, and I hope it's accurate. Mary, anything to add to that?
No.
All right. Going off that, second part of that was the amount of water available to downstream is not changed or improved. It seems like the rate of discharge is moderated to accommodate fish passage. So there's no extra water discharge. What is the benefit?
Right. So there is additional water discharged because the original water right that was physically removing water from the river is no longer. So there's new water available until, of course, the bank is fully allocated, and then you're back to square one where you started. I think there was a question about what's the benefit to fish? And the short answer to that is it's not about benefit to fish in this particular case. a water bank is not designed to be beneficial for fish. What it's designed for is to provide a way to move water rights between different people. That's what it's for.
Right. So we have, so the reservoir behind the dam could be lowered at a faster rate prior to a storm that might cause flooding downstream. Since the dam is an earthen construction, there were two concerns. Is it possible to increase the size of the pipe without damaging the integrity of the dam?
Sorry, Casey, hang on a second.
Okay.
That's the second half of a question that Ron Averill posed, and he was providing some background
Okay.
about this. I do think we should read that, but we should read both those parts at one. And I don't think it was a question. I think it was a statement.
Okay. Would you like me to read that first part then?
Yeah, if you read those both together, I think that's a good
Okay.
addition.
Sorry, I was a little confused. Okay.
Yeah.
Around 2006 to 2008, while the Army Corps of Engineers was looking at levees throughout Centralia and Chehalis and the Skookumchuck Dam, there was a consideration given to increasing the size of the pipe through,
That's where it closes off. So through the dam.
through the dam.
Would you
So
like
the
me to-
reservoir behind the dam could be lowered at a faster rate prior to a storm that might cause flooding downstream. Since the dam is an earthen construction, there were two concerns. Is it possible to increase the size of the pipe without damaging the integrity of the dam? The second concern was potential seismic vulnerability of the dam during an earthquake. The Corps project was terminated before either of these questions were answered.
Yeah, and to follow on, there still absolutely would be geotechnical and structural concerns with either of the options, fish passage or a new outlet. However, tunneling, such as through bedrock, which maybe could go around the dam rather than through it, has become much more feasible and commonly used than it was 20 years ago. So there are additional considerations that could be brought to bear if any of these options proceed into a design phase.
All right. If the dam is removed, could TransAlta still remove the same amount of water from the river?
No.
No. Yeah, the dam and the water rights were basically tied together. So the dam was created to provide those water rights.
And then are water rights passed on to beneficiaries when the water right holder passes?
Passes as in dies?
I think so.
I can't answer that question. I do not know. I mean, they're property rights, so maybe I'm sorry. That one I think we're gonna have to talk to our water rights folks to answer.
All right. Once again, why are we talking about funding from other sources when TransAlta holds the rights and is choosing to keep it to make money?
I think the short answer to that question is TransAlta isn't required to do any of the things we're talking about today. They can choose to continue to operate the dam exactly the way that it is now, which will mean no changes to downstream flood benefits and no changes to fish. So we mentioned that the interventions we're talking about are in the millions or tens of millions of dollars. So I think it's unlikely that TransAlta would be interested in funding that entirely themselves, since they're not required to do so.
All right, we have a question. And at the moment, this is our second to last question. Why keep the dam?
Well, I think the simple answer to that is it's TransAlta's choice whether the dam stays or goes. And I guess if we get into their heads a little bit, I think TransAlta has made it clear that they're interested in operating the dam to maintain their water bank. And that's their primary interest with the Skookumchuck Dam.
All right. And then we just had a question about how many people were attending this webinar, and comment to you for thank you for holding this webinar. So
I think I saw our peak at about 100 people. Is that right, Casey?
yeah, it was about 100 when it was at peak. It's dipped now, but yes.
Thank you. If we don't have any more questions, I think we can wrap up. I did want to say a couple of things before we close out. The main thing I wanted to mention is that, as we said a couple of times in the presentation, our ultimate goal with this phase 2 of this study is to create a report to the Chehalis Basin Board. We're going to create a draft and a final report. Our hope is that the final will go in front of the board either towards the end of this year or towards the beginning of next year. So if you're interested in continuing to follow this, keep an eye on the Chehalis Basin Board. And also, I think what we will be doing is collecting the email addresses of the folks who attended tonight. And I think we can commit to letting you all know when that final report is going in front of the board, in case you'd like a copy or you'd like to attend the board meeting. Anything else we should mention before we wrap up tonight, Mary or Casey?
Thanks everybody for attending.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Good night.